When I first felt God called me to long-term missions, my first response to the idea of raising support seemed like an impossible task, and it felt like a lonely place to be.
It's embarrassing when I have to ask my friends for money.
It would make me feel like a beggar if I'm asking someone I don't know to support me.
How can I make my needs known without feeling guilty about it?
You know, many Christians who might be considering full-time missionary service are oftentimes more terrified of the thought of raising support than they are of being the possible martyr on the mission field. It's made me think, what is it that we oftentimes have to deal with in this possibility of raising support? Sometimes I think we might have to become a salesman, we might become a Christian beggar, we might be a welfare recipient in a sense. And yet I've lived this way for over 20 years, and I'm convinced that it's a privileged lifestyle. I'm convinced that God intended for those of us in full-time missionary work to join with others who partner with us as a team, that we're all working together to see the Great Commission fulfilled. These cliffs here in England remind me so much of the cliffs in Hawaii, where I began and ended my book Friendraising. On those cliffs, God gave me new inspiration and new understanding of His ways in support raising. One of the biggest and most important principles that He taught me was one of interdependence. And I believe that we see interdependence and God's principles and His design in that throughout nature. I believe it's also how God intended for us to relate in this world, and especially for those of us who are full-time Christian workers, for us to be able to be effective, we must be interdependent with others. But I think we struggle with this because we've learned well how to be independent. We haven't learned so well how to be interdependent. We've learned how to be self-sufficient, how to make it on our own, but not necessarily how to lean on one another in a healthy way. And I believe that through support raising, this actually is in a sense, a forced lifestyle of that, but a wonderful one in which we see the principles of interdependence brought into our life in a more flourishing way, in a way that I think that God intended for us all to live in the first place. These trees here on the side of the cliff have developed strong root systems, and because of that, they've been able to live here, they've been able to endure. We in full-time Christian work also need to develop strong root systems, a strong support system. And through the 4 pillars of friend-raising, I believe that we can do that. The first pillar is that of friend-raising. The second pillar is that of generosity and good financial stewardship. The third pillar is that of communication. And the fourth pillar is prayer with promises. With all these 4 pillars in place, I believe that we can see a support system developed and established so that we can be long-term full-time Christian workers. We'd like to tell you a bit more about those 4 pillars in this video. Friendship is really what the essence of life is from the beginning. God's friendship with us and our friendship with one another. And as we see different scenes of people relating to one another, realizing that that's where our deepest needs are met, I think we can realize that in fundraising and support raising, that friend raising is actually the better emphasis. That we shouldn't see it as how do we get the money? How do we get the support that is needed? But Lord, how do we honor the relationships that you've given us? And how do we walk in your ways so that the friendship is more important than the support? And yet it's through our friendship with others, it's through our commitment to one another and our interdependence that we meet one another's needs. And I believe it's also through that God intended to have His work, the people working full-time in ministry, that they be supported through those friendships. One of my favorite examples of friend-raising is Barb Mossberg. She's a woman missionary in the Philippines. And I saw her a few years ago at a conference. She came up to me and she said, you know, Betty, I'm seeing at least $700 a month in unsolicited support come in from my ministry. And I looked at her and I said, Barb, how could that be? What are you doing? And she said, well, first of all, she said, I spend about 18 hours a week writing letters back home. And I thought, 18 hours a week? That's horrendous. I said, you must love writing letters. And she said, no, not exactly. I said, well, so what's motivating you to do this? She said, I can't stand the thought of being in missions and not having the people back home with me. And she said, I know I also won't make it long term without them. And so I'm very motivated to write letters back home. She said, I also have a prayer commitment to see 100 young people go into missions as a direct result of my life. And that's also part of my motivation for writing these letters. She also told me a story where a man, a farmer, had come up to her right before she went to the Philippines, and he said, I've got some leftover seeds from this year's farming. Can you use them? She ended up taking 10 pounds of seeds to the Philippines and presented them as a gift to the tribal village that she began living in. They planted a garden. She took a photograph of that garden, sent it back home. He got other farmers together. They sent 100 pounds of seeds to this small village area in the Philippines. And as I heard her tell this story, I realized what an honoring lifestyle we have to help knit people back home into our ministry. Not just that we would be satisfied and fulfilled in our ministry, but that many others too would be blessed. I also realize it's a real privilege for them to have an opportunity through us to minister into parts of the world they would normally never have the opportunity to. And so through hearing Barb's story and some of the different elements and her commitment to people back home, I realized that's what this is all about. We've got to help bring people with us so that we're not alone, but we also need to give them the privilege of joining in worldwide ministry. Friend-raising is all about our commitment to one another as friends, our caring for one another, our honesty with one another, and our intimacy. And we need to be careful that in the whole midst of support raising that we don't see the support as more important than the friendship. If we do, I think the love of money can come in and perhaps taint and twist the principles that God has intended for us to live by. And that is one of a commitment to people seeking first the kingdom and not seeking first the things. And that's what friend raising is really all about. I was in Mexico City in 1986, and I was asking the Lord, what's the key to support raising? I'd just been asked to speak to a group of Guatemalan missionaries in training, and to be honest, I was a bit terrified, wondering if I, as a North American, had a particular perspective that perhaps didn't apply to them as well. But I was asking God, what is your perspective, and what is your key to support raising? And one word, generosity, shot into my mind. And that's what makes up this second pillar of friend raising, is generosity with good financial stewardship. As I've meditated on that thought, I knew immediately that it was not for other people to be generous to us, but it was for us to live a lifestyle of generosity. And through that, other people would be drawn to join with us in the Great Commission. Through giving and receiving, we're knit together. But most of us are more familiar with this kind of a setting that I'm standing in. It's a buying and selling setting. It's a market scene. It's the traditional means by which we handle our money on a day-to-day basis. But I've come to the conviction that God's system of finances primarily is one of giving and receiving. It transcends this ordinary means of handling finances. This is the norm. Nothing wrong. It's what all of us have to do. But giving and receiving is something that supersedes that. It transcends it. This 13th century abbey reminds me so much of the moving scene when Jesus threw the buying and selling people out of the temple. It's caused me a lot of thought, wondering why was he so angry at what was happening at the temple at that moment. And as I've looked at all 4 gospel accounts of that scene, I've seen that there's one aspect where they were using people, taking advantage of them, and they were displacing the purposes of the household of God for that in buying and selling. But I also wonder, as I've thought about it, I wonder if giving and receiving, I wonder if generosity is really what's intended to be the primary means of handling finances in the household of God. I believe it's something that so far transcends the normal handling of finances, of buying and selling. It knits people together. It involves not just a transaction of goods, but a transaction that not only affects us physically, but I think also spiritually. And in this, it makes me wonder too, are we, as full-time Christian workers, not intended to be knit into this lifestyle of giving and receiving primarily? From the Levites in the Old Testament through to Luke 8, where we see that Jesus was supported by a group of women out of their own means, to Paul with his own different discourses of talking about workers of the church being supported by the church. I believe that God's intention for us is that giving and receiving, is that generosity would be the primary means through which we would see the work of the church, the kingdom of God, go forward.
We have one mother in our church, and she lives alone with 2 little guys, and she needed a new car, and she had, even for this, not enough money. But as she heard that I need money to serve the Lord, she said, okay, all other things are not necessary and not important like this, so I will give my money to you. She gave me a lot of money in this time, right in the beginning, and she wrote me all over the time, and in some of the letters she sent me money again. So I was really amazed about her.
That wonderful story of generosity that we just heard shows how sacrificial generosity is really part of God's ways in this whole area of giving and receiving. And yet when someone gives that sacrificially, as that woman did, we can sometimes struggle with a sense of, well, should I accept it? Or perhaps, I should help them. They need it more than I do. And yet I believe that God wants to give us new understanding to realize that both the giver and the receiver are blessed. Both giver and receiver actually increase in their spiritual account, is the way that Paul describes it in the scriptures. And so in understanding generosity and realizing the strength that comes through giving and receiving, there's a righteous foundation that is built. We are able to encourage one another. We're not only able to encourage physically, but I believe something happens spiritually. And generosity becomes the foundation and a platform that actually breathes much life in us and through us to others. Communication is the foundation for relationships. God's designed it for us in our prayer relationship with Him and in our relationships with people back home, our friends, our family, our supporters, our church. We must keep up in communication and spend a good amount of time on that, or else the relationships will shrivel. Without communication, we don't have relationships. So I think we need to see that as an important part of our ongoing ministry, but to remember that it needs to be personal and not just trying to be the perfect missionary to people, but sharing what God's doing in our heart and in our ministry and through our lives and what a typical day might be. I think oftentimes people think about George Mueller, who was a minister in Great Britain, and he never shared about needs, but many people supported his work. What oftentimes people don't realize is he was communicating massively to many people, but he was sharing his heart, he was sharing his vision, he was sharing the ministry, and not trying to get people on board.